So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for indulging me by reading a couple of chapters from my book. In fact, the first of those two chapters, chapter 8, is probably the most forbidding chapter in the book. So that's like bad news for the weekend that you probably just failed to enjoy, but good news if you want to read the rest of the book, because it's all downhill from here. Okay, so I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of sort of context before kind of getting into the nitty gritty. And then I'm going to try and explain some of what I was trying to do in chapter 8 in particular, so you can kind of see where that was coming from. And also little glimpses of what's happening in chapters 1 through 7. And then finally, I want to bring this all into conversation with what you're doing in the research group on co-productions. So my book isn't about religion, but it takes place in a medieval universe in which religion was kind of the air people breathed. And it's also not a book about the co-production of religion, but there are definitely implications for religious co-production. So I'm going to try to draw those out. The cover of the book, which you may or may not have seen if you're reading a PDF version, has this fantastic illustration on it that the minute it was brought to my attention by a friend, I knew was going to be the cover of this book, because it depicts, actually it's part of an illuminated manuscript depicting two angels tallying up the good and bad deeds. This is based on a verse from the Quran, but the angels are depicted as chancery scribes, writing very long decrees in Arabic with wide line spacing. And that to me is kind of emblematic of the way in which people were quite aware of how state documents looked and worked in the Islamic universe in the Middle Ages. But the kinds of documents that you're seeing there being written by these angels, let me just show you the context of the page itself, had their origins in the Fatimid Caliphate, which is completely weird because the Fatimids are often kind of regarded as like a sideshow in Islamic history, and the wider flow of caliphates and other regimes, sultanates, that are by and large Sunni in the kind of classical telling of the tale. But the Fatimids as a Shi'i caliphate in some ways partook very integrally of what their Sunni predecessors, especially the Abbasids, had been doing. And in some ways they started a completely new ballgame when it came to how they were interacting with their subjects. So that's one of the main themes that I want to try to bring out of what I'm going to say to you here. So I wrote the book because there had been a kind of going lament in the field of medieval Islamic studies for decades about a dearth of documentation. So the field had relied on largely long form sources. And long form sources, for me as a social historian, are to be taken with a certain amount of suspicion because they were read by very few people. Of course, people came into contact with the contents of long form works orally as well, but this was by and large a preserve of the elite. And when you look at one-page texts, so documents, which is what I generally like to look at, you get a very different sense of the kind of breadth of society and not just the elites. So just to kind of give you a sense of what these laments of, I skipped a step. So the field had relied on long form works and sort of this ingrained habit of looking at elite literature, so normative works and also chronicles, narrative works, essentially turned people off of the hunt for the one-page documents, to the point where people just kind of persuaded themselves that, well, these one-page documents don't really exist, and so we shouldn't even look for them. So then along came Michael Chamberlain, who wrote a really, really interesting book in the 90s Knowledge and Social Practice in Medieval Damascus, 1190 to 1350, where he said, okay, let's stop actually complaining about the lack of documents and the proliferation of long form works, especially biographical dictionaries, which are like this, incredibly common genre that all of us use in the field. They're really convenient if you want to get a sense of like, who was out there and who was doing what, who were the physicians, who was transmitting hadith. And so for Chamberlain, this was like, this had to be explained. The proliferation of biographical dictionaries was itself a really interesting fact that he wanted to explain. So that was great. But in the process of doing that, there was this kind of assumption embedded in his work where it wasn't just that there weren't documents. According to Chamberlain, there were good reasons why there weren't documents. Okay, so let me just give you like the quotation where he lays this out. He says, in the high medieval Middle East, rulers maintained patrimonial, if not absolutist claims, considered most of the wealth of their subjects their own, and permitted other social bodies none of the formal autonomies they had in Europe. Individuals, households, religious bodies, and groups did not brandish documents as proofs of hereditary status, privilege, or property to the extent they did in the Latin West, nor were their strategies of social reproduction recorded, sanctified, or fought out through documents to the extent they were in Europe. So there are a couple of things in this little passage that are, worthy of discussion, and I'll just kind of pass briefly through them. So first of all, the idea that if you have documents, you're somehow able to contest the otherwise uncontested rights of what he's calling patrimonial, if not absolutist, rule. And then he's saying that in the Latin West, people actually did assert their rights through documents, whereas in the Islamic East, they did not assert rights through documents. In fact, what they did was compete for social status through other means, especially biographical dictionaries. So on the one hand, it's like a pretty brilliant thesis, because he's saying, we can actually explain the fact that we have the sources that we do that have kind of shaped our approaches in the field. But on the other hand, he's also sort of embedding this assumption that is actually empirically false, which is that documents have not survived from the medieval Middle East. So I show you this as a kind of example of, in a way, the extreme statement of the position that the field bought into for many years, but also in some ways, I think the most creative and interesting statement of that idea. In fact, just to give you kind of glimpses of the documents that do exist, there are an estimated 100,000 Arabic documents on papyrus and paper, the vast majority in Vienna alone. There are many in Egypt. In fact, most of the documentation that we have survived in Egypt, although we also have documentation from Central Asia and from the Islamic West, especially Andalus, from the period before 1300. Of those estimated 100,000 documents, about 1,000 have been published. So this is part of the problem, right? Is that people don't work on these documents enough, and that furthers the impression that the documents don't exist because they don't get published. In fact, for the period before 1200, you could argue that actually more original documents have survived from the Middle East, in part because of the problem of cartularies in the Latin West. Cartularies are codices that summarize documents. And in the process of putting these cartularies together, the original forms of the documents went astray, ceased to exist, were deliberately destroyed. And so what that means is that you have copies, and the copies are interesting, right? Because who put these cartularies together? This is a whole, a whole thing that's been analyzed. But in terms of original documentation, we're actually very fortunate in the medieval Middle East, whether you're looking at documents on papyrus that have survived from Egypt before about 900, documents on paper after 900, and especially after 1000, or in Central Asia, there are many documents that were written on leather, as well as paper, since Central Asia adopted paper before Egypt and the rest of the Mediterranean. Then there's the Cairo Geniza. So the Cairo Geniza turns out to be a substantial source of documentation, especially in Arabic, which is a little weird because the Geniza is known for having preserved documents in Hebrew script. In fact, there are even more documents in Arabic script than I realized when I started the project that turned into the Lost Archives. So I'll just tell you a little bit about that. So the Cairo Geniza is a kind of misnomer, like a misnomer squared, a double misnomer, because it's neither from Cairo, nor is it just one Geniza. It's actually many Genizot in the plural. So I'm showing you now a map of Cairo in the 10th century. So Cairo proper was the Fatimid royal city. The Fatimids were a dynasty that arose, I'll show you like a bigger map in a second, in 909 in central North Africa, and they entered Egypt in 969 and ruled until 1171. So it was the Fatimids who founded Cairo as a palatine complex. So this wasn't a city where people lived. This was a kind of walled entity where government offices and where the palace were. And in terms of where like regular people lived in Fustat. So this is the Fustat is the medieval residential core of the city of Cairo. And then eventually this area between the two cities gets filled in over the course of the 12th and especially the 13th centuries. And it's at that point that we can really speak of the city of Cairo as a kind of larger conglomerate. So if you zoom into Fustat, you see that there are, on this map, yellow buildings, which are churches, green buildings, which are mosques, and then there is this blue building at the bottom of the map, and that is the Ben Ezra Synagogue. That's a 20th century name. In fact, it was called something completely different in the period that I study. It was called the Synagogue of the Syrians. The Syrians are the Palestinians. Shamiyin is the term. And when Jews use the term Shamiyin, they both meant the entire Eastern Mediterranean littoral, and they also meant Palestine in particular. And Palestine for Jews, what did that mean? That meant the place where some of the classical rabbinic literature had been composed and eventually written down. So the Mishnah around 200, and then the Palestinian Talmud over the course of the 4th century. So it was kind of, so the cities that were associated that were Tiberias, especially in Galilee, and then eventually Jerusalem after the Islamic conquests, when Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. So the synagogue of the Shamiyin is the synagogue where people prayed who liturgically followed the rite of Palestine, as opposed to the rite of Babylonia or Mesopotamia or Iraq. Okay, so inside this synagogue, now known as the Ben Ezra, there was a chamber. I'm going to take you inside the synagogue now. So this is the synagogue as it is today. I got this actually, the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, right at the beginning of the pandemic, started posting these great virtual tours of Egyptian monuments. So this is what this is taken of. You can do like a 3D virtual tour of the Ben Ezra Synagogue. But this is in fact a late 19th century building, built as far as anybody can tell from the sources that we have, built on the footprint of the medieval synagogue, which itself had been built in the 11th century on the footprint of an earlier building. So it was probably the size and more or less the volume of the original Ben Ezra. And in the original Ben Ezra, as in the modern one, so we're looking at the women's gallery now. So the place where women would pray, as opposed to men who would pray on the main floor. So we're in the mezzanine level. And if you go around to the back of the mezzanine level, which is actually the front of the synagogue, you see a little opening in the wall. And that is where Jews for many, many hundreds of years, from when this synagogue was built in the 1020s until when it was rebuilt in the 1890s, would deposit their worn writings. So mostly paper and parchment, a little bit of papyrus, because in the beginning there were some very old documents that were being deposited. And so eventually this chamber filled up with lots and lots of documentation. And then over the course of the late 19th century, began to be increasingly come to the attention of scholars, until eventually the synagogue was completely emptied of all of its manuscripts, and they were split up over different libraries. So just to give you a sense of the big picture, because the numbers are actually something that we now have a much, much better sense of than we did even 10 years ago, in part because of digitization and in part because of proliferating research on the Geniza. So the vast majority of what was found in this Geniza chamber dates to between 950 and 1250. But there are significant pockets from the Ottoman period. So the 16th century in particular, when lots of Sephardi immigrants came to Egypt. And then again in the 19th century, where there's just a kind of proliferation of everything in general in Egypt. But still this classical core is most of what there is. The total number of pages or fragments of pages, because most of what was in there was fragmentary, since people tended to throw out their written materials once they had already reached a state of disuse and fragmentariness. So roughly 400,000 pages or fragments of pages, which is obviously like an enormous amount. But what does that mean when we talk about pages or fragments of pages? About 90% of that are texts that were written and meant for posterity. So I put books in quotation marks because a book could be many different things in this period. And in fact, most of these books were like pamphlet sized, not like a big chunky codex, but rather just a quire, which is a much more affordable medium for the circulation of knowledge. So those are these long form works that I talked about at the beginning that were the preserve of elites. So that's most of what was in the Geniza. However, then there are about 40,000 documents. This is a kind of wild guesstimate, but it's an informed one in the sense that in the Princeton Geniza project, which is the online database that I direct, we've now identified something like 32,000 documents, but we haven't yet thoroughly been through everything. So 32,000 is quite a bit. It's a lot more than the generations before us who were aware of between 10 and 15,000 documents. So we now have sort of double the amount of documentation that generation did, which is very exciting. This is just to show you an example of what these documents look like. So this is a relatively whole one. It does happen to have a big lacuna right in the middle, but luckily it's a marriage contract, which means we more or less know what it says, because this is a relatively formulaic text. And even if you didn't know this was a legal document, you could probably guess by the fact that there are these signatures at the bottom. This is another example of a document. This has become one of my favorites over the last couple of years. It's a letter from a Jewish trader, originally from Libya, who is making his way down the Red Sea towards India in 1103. And he's utterly terrified because so far he's only ever traveled on Mediterranean boats, which have nails in them. And at a certain point in his journey on the Red Sea, his entire party shifts to a boat that's tied together with coconut coir ropes. And he's extremely nervous about this, and but not so nervous that he doesn't find it in him to write to his brother-in-law in rhyme about how frightened he is of his journey. So there's all kinds of just super, super charming documents that, you know, unfortunately, like, take a really long time to understand and read and translate, because these guys are writing in the middle of a conversation and you're not privy to the rest of the conversation in most cases. So by the fact that he's from Libya, going down the Red Sea and on his way to India, you can gather that the geographic remit of what we have in the Geniza is quite large. So there's plenty of documentation from the Iberian Peninsula. There are Jews in the 13th century in Sumatra, documented in the Geniza, and kind of everything in between. And it gives you a totally different perspective on what people like to talk about now as being the global Middle Ages. This is truly the global Middle Ages. One of the reasons that Geniza documents cover such a vast span of the globe is the geographic mobility of the communities that it documents. But another is that it comes from Cairo in an especially cosmopolitan period in the history of Cairo. So it's like, incredible historical good luck. So there had been trade between China and the Mediterranean across the Indian Ocean from at least the 9th century, but the vast majority of that trade was until the 10th century was centered on the Persian Gulf. So that was kind of the main terminus of the China trade. In the late 10th century, that begins to change. And by the 11th century, you have a burgeoning trade between the Indian Ocean world and the Mediterranean world that centers on Cairo. Okay, so let's have a look at what's going on here in the Mediterranean. The reason trade began coming increasingly through Egypt was a new dynasty that was particularly adept at facilitating the transit trade and at exploiting its position kind of at the hinge between the Mediterranean trade and the Indian Ocean trade, and that was the Fatimids. The Fatimids took full advantage of their location astride the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean systems. They were very good at taxing the transit trade as well. That was like their stake in the game. But the result was that the world shifted under Fatimid rule. So the map I'm showing you right now is the early Fatimid period. The Fatimids arose in 909 in Central North Africa. And so just to keep your eye on the map for a moment, the lavender areas are controlled by the Abbasids, the Sunni Abbasids, and the green areas are the Fatimids. But then in 969, when the Fatimids begin to move east, this is what happens. So after 969, the Mediterranean is very much a Fatimid sea. And that has consequences in terms of trade and economy. What's fascinating is that people were kind of aware of the momentousness of the shift that was taking place from the economic center having been Iraq under the Abbasids to the economic center of the Islamic world being Egypt under the Fatimids. So a geographer around 990 called al-Maqdisi, originally from an Iranian family, but from Jerusalem, wrote around 990, Baghdad has been superseded until the day of judgment. Egypt's metropole has now become the greatest glory of the Muslims. So even at the time itself, there was a sense of this shift taking place. So that's just to say that it's incredibly lucky that all this documentation that we have happens to come from Egypt in the especially 11th and 12th centuries, because if you were going to put a Geniza anywhere and try to understand global medieval history, it would probably be Egypt. Okay, so today Geniza collections are scattered across more than 60 libraries and private collections. That's one of the challenges of using these things, is that there's a lot of different material to kind of bring together. Much of it is in Cambridge. So Cambridge University Library has the largest collection of Geniza fragments. The Jewish Theological Seminary in New York has the second largest collection. And then the National Library of Russia, this is why we have to talk about Genizot in the plural, because that was actually a completely different source in a different synagogue, the Karaite synagogue in Cairo. And then you have lots of sort of medium-sized collections, again, from the Ben Ezra synagogue. The story of the Geniza's discovery is a really fun one to read about. So Sacred Trash, The Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza by Dina Hoffman and Peter Cole is like a wonderfully fun book about these late 19th and early 20th century characters who became kind of obsessed with the Geniza. But recently, the story that they tell in this book has been problematized or complicated by Rebecca Jefferson. who has written a book where she talks about the various sources of documentation that were getting kind of passed off either in the antiquities market or in the libraries themselves in the early 20th century as being from the Geniza, even if they weren't necessarily from the Geniza. So we're really talking about a much more kind of mixed cache of documents. And so, you know, we should probably get in the habit of saying Cairo Genizas rather than Geniza in the singular. The vast majority of what came out of the Geniza is in Hebrew script. So this probably has to do with a Jewish custom in the Middle Ages of not casually destroying anything in Hebrew script. But Hebrew script means not just Hebrew language, it also means Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic in Hebrew characters, which is in fact the most common language that you find in the Geniza, especially in the documentary Geniza. There's also some Aramaic, although Aramaic was no longer a spoken language. It was a technical language that was used in legal documents and some other kinds of texts. And then also Judeo-Persian and many other Judeo languages, so languages that are written in Hebrew script. But there was a significant quantity of documentation also preserved in the Geniza in Arabic script written by Jews and Muslims alike. And the Arabic script documents were neglected for a long time. So this is like one of my favorite ways to kind of exemplify the neglect of these documents is that if you look in the 1906 catalog of the Bodleian Geniza collections, every time there's an Arabic script document, it is cataloged as scribbling. Because documentary Arabic is challenging to read for technical reasons that I can get into if you're interested. Nobody had figured out how to decipher these documentary texts yet, so it just looked like scribbling. But also, of course, there was a perception that the Arabic script material wasn't relevant to Jewish history, to the point where in many cases, the Arabic script material wasn't even properly conserved. So this is a box of Arabic documents that was sitting in the vault in the Jewish Theological Seminary Library until 2014. And in 2014, I received an email from a paper conservator at JTS saying, you know, I've heard that you're interested in Arabic documents. You might be interested to know that there's this, which I'm in the process of conserving. And I got really excited because I spotted right here in the middle of the box a Fatimid tax receipt, and that was a kind of document that I was getting interested in working on. And so eventually this material was conserved and photographed, and now it's available for study. But you know, it's kind of amazing that this has been in circulation for less than a decade. If you dig into the Arabic documentation, you find lots and lots of different genres. So there are trade letters in Arabic script. There are accounts and notes and ephemera of every conceivable variety. But one of the most exciting things to come out of all of this Arabic script documentation were state documents. So documents that were written in the Fatimid chancery or by Fatimid officials in the territory. And what's fascinating about that is that we have so little original documentation from states, right? So there's lots and lots of documents that have survived in Arabic script, but actually trying to figure out how do states run and how do states operate, that's something that has become possible because of these Arabic documents. So in this case, this is kind of like a fun one because it's a huge Fatimid decree. The decrees were generally these ceremonial documents that were written in a very grand and impressive way. This one is in 7 parts. It's a join, which means a fragment of a single text that was pieced together later by scholars, in this case by someone named Ronnie Shweka, who was able to piece it together because he wasn't actually interested in the Arabic side. He was interested in the Hebrew script side. He was looking for a particular genre of text called She'iltot, and he found 120 fragments of it in the Geniza and was able to piece together 7 of them as this single vertical scroll, a rotulus. So this was basically a desperate cantor who needed material for a sermon, and also needed a very long piece of paper to write on. And one of the best, ways that you could avail yourself of a long piece of paper to write on was to find a reused decree. Often these were sold as scrap paper there's a used paper trade. And I can talk about that more if you're interested, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So it turns out that these Arabic documents were in some ways ubiquitous, and you sort of have to understand the economy of the Arabic documents and kind of how they circulated in order to understand the Hebrew that's on the other side of them. In this case, this sermon could have been mistaken to be an actual, like, responsible scribal copy of the text that we know as the She'iltot. But actually, if you take it in the context of the larger set of scribal habits, so scribes being desperate for writing material, especially when they have to give sermons, as well as some aspects of the layout, you realize this is not actually a copy of a text. It's a kind of act of bricolage where the scribe who wrote this side was simply, desperate for material to deliver as a sermon in the synagogue, and that's why he wrote this down. And so if you were to do a critical edition of this text, you might want to approach this manuscript witness with a certain amount of caution. In preparation for this seminar, for talking to you, I decided to run some numbers and see of the documentary texts from the Geniza that my team has cataloged and identify the languages of. So we've been on a campaign for the last 4 years to get better numbers. And one of the things we've done is to try to list out all the documents by language. To my great surprise, there are actually more documents in Arabic script than there are in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, which I mean, even I wasn't expecting that. So this slide, I just pulled these numbers yesterday evening, and I almost fell off my chair. So there's quite a bit of Arabic script material, and will fuel dissertations, I hope, for many years to come. But just to show you a couple more of these decrees that seem to come up all over the place. This is part of a Fatimid decree that was reused by a scribe who was writing out sections of the Babylonian Talmud. In this case, we have a decree that was used for poetry. This is the draft of a letter. This is some calendrical material written between the lines of a decree of appointment, in this case for a qadi. This is Jewish liturgy. These are trade letters written on the backs of decrees. So these things are a little bit all over the place. And that was basically why I wrote the Lost Archive, to try to explain why you have all these fragments of state documents. Jews were not the only ones who were reusing Fatimid decrees. This is a Christian text. So it's a 9th century text, the Canon of Andreas of Crete, and an 11th century copy written again on the back of a Fatimid decree. And in this case, we have some kind of a bilingual, probably treaty. So it's in Arabic and Latin, and a notary in Genova has written between the lines of it. So there's a 12th century notarial notebook that's constructed in part from dismembered official documents. And here we have a Muslim who's reusing, in this case, not a Fatimid decree, but a Mamluk decree, so one of the later Egyptian dynasties. And this, the person who's reusing them is al-Maqrizi, who's a historian of the 15th century, who's one of our actually best sources on the Fatimid period, because he was very interested in the Fatimids and preserved lots of good stuff. Okay, so all of that is basically context, so sort of introductory. And now what I want to do is get into the question of how the documents can give us a kind of different perspective on questions of co-production. One thing that interests me in the state documents is the semiotics of paper and ink, and how states and classes of officials would project power using paper and ink. And the second thing I'm going to tell you about is the importance of petitioning and the expertise that subjects developed in submitting petitions to state officials and to the caliph and vizier in particular, and how that ended up impacting Jews' own communal organization. Okay, so let me just say a word about what I mean in the book when I talk about diplomatics, for those who haven't yet had the pleasure. So diplomatics is a technical term used for the study of documents, and specifically the structure of documents. In other words, their verbal structure, how many sections do they have? Are there patterns? Are there repeated patterns? Even letters, which are largely free text, also have a diplomatics, because you can map letters according to the sections, right? So a trade letter will open by saying, I am writing to you from such and such a place. All is well with me, thank God. I received your letter, and there'll be about 3 lines of what a student of mine calls the paper trail, right? Where you're saying, like, I received this letter from you and I sent another letter to you, but I don't know if you received that because I never received an answer to it, because you can't rely on the mail. Then there'll be some information about commodities and trading. And then usually demands, like, please send me X number of such and such a thing, or don't send me this kind of coin because nobody accepts them here. Instead, send me this other kind of coin. And then greetings to the family, and that's it. And so, you know, when you kind of realize that even a document that seems so spontaneous, like a letter, actually itself also has a diplomatics, you can sort of analyze them in a different way. But diplomatics is also about the physical appearance of documents, and often the physical appearance can have meaning and kind of, you know, deepen your sense of how these documents do their work. So all the stuff that you read in the first few pages of chapter 8 about, like, you know, the orenga in decrees, all of that is from diplomatics. Okay, so this decree, in this particular case, this is a decree that was written at the Fatimid Chancery, but sent to a lower official. So many of these decrees were written simply to give orders to people in the territory. The decree itself would have been drafted by the head of the Chancery and then produced in this kind of fancy looking copy by a calligrapher. And part of the way these documents did their work was not just by telling lower officials what to do, but also by telling them what to do in a very impressive looking way. So this is a very wasteful decree, because you can see there's tons and tons of blank space. This is another example of the same kind of thing, but the decree that I'm showing you on the left, which was preserved in the archive of the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, was issued not to lower officials, but rather to petitioners. So the monks of St. Catherine itself had all kinds of issues to do with their taxes. Often these decrees are about taxes. And they petitioned the Fatimid vizier, and this is the decree that they received in response, which in fact quotes from their petition. So you can see that these documents have certain things in common: the wide line spacing, a certain kind of calligraphy, I'll talk a little bit more about the physical characteristics, but I just want to say that while we don't have, so this is something that I get into a little bit in chapter 8, while we don't have any original surviving Abbasid decrees from this period or earlier, we do have copies of Abbasid decrees. And we also have enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that when you're looking at these Fatimid decrees, none of these features was actually new under the Fatimids. In fact, all of the diplomatic features that you can find in the Fatimid decree were like 98% likely also there in the Abbasid decrees that preceded the Fatimids. So already this is kind of interesting because the Fatimids being Shi'is and being also rival caliphs, they thought they were like, you know, they were the real caliphs, and the Abbasids you know, were corrupt and had gone, you know, something had gone wrong, and the Fatimids were there to sort of restore it and get it right. So in some sense, the fact that the Fatimids existed at all was because they were, you know, negating the legitimacy of the Abbasids. On the other hand, they were also using Abbasid diplomatics in actually communicating with both subjects and with officials in Fatimid territory. So that's kind of one fascinating point, right? Is that you had this continuity in state document production, despite a radical discontinuity in ideology. So now, just to get into the physical features that that you might want to pay attention to in what I'm about to say. So Fatimid state documents are written on paper, and that is important because if you're coming from the European, the Latin European perspective, you might think that parchment would be the more prestigious writing material. But in fact, in this period, state documents are written on paper, and paper has its own form of prestige. And that's why the state adopted it and the state used it. And I get into that in chapters 4 through 7 of the book. So if you're interested in the history of paper, that's the place to go. In terms of format, the decrees are long vertical scrolls. And in terms of layout, they have the very wide line spacing. The lines are what I call boat-shaped because they go sort of slightly downwards and then markedly upwards. So they have almost this kind of like gondola like shape. They also have a fragmented baseline, which is to say, each word in this case is written on its own separate baseline, almost like stair steps, to the point where the words then actually stack up at the ends of lines. And that contributes to that sort of boat-like shape that you see in the way the lines are written. The script itself is a curvilinear script, which is new in the 10th century. And the rise of curvilinear scripts, we actually have a lot of information about it. It was a bunch of officials working under the Abbasids in the 930s and 940s who said, you know, enough of the old ways of writing. This is the way to do calligraphy the right way. And eventually, the most prolific examples that we have of this curvilinear script come not from the Abbasids who invented it, but rather from the Fatimids who adopted it. It's also a proportion script. Again, that gets into some technicalities that I can go into if you're interested, and a variable width ductus. So this is actually really beautiful. If you see the way the strokes go from wide to narrow and then back to wide again, partly that has to do with the way you cut the pen. I actually have a reed pen right here that I like to experiment with my graduate students. So part of it has to do with the way you cut the nib, the angle at which you cut it. And part of it has to do with actually the way you turn the pen as you're writing. So this is kind of an amazing optical illusion because it's meant to look as though it was written very quickly with a minimal lifting of the pen off the page. But in fact, it probably took a lot of time to write something like this. So you can also see these hairlines connecting letters that canonically are not supposed to be connected in Arabic. And that also gives you the illusion that this was written with great fluidity. So there's a lot going on here in the script, a lot of a lot of skill and a lot of skills that were new in the period. Abusive ligatures is a wonderful term that I did not invent. This is a term invented by Eva Grob, referring to the connection of letters that are not supposed to be connected in Arabic, but these guys connect them because, again, that gives you kind of the illusion that your hand is like barely lifting off the page because you're writing with maximum flow and efficiency. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of how, when the Fatimids conquered Egypt, they were totally unashamed about using kind of the old methods of decree writing and writing or representing the state in writing. So in part, the Fatimids also inherited their administration from the Abbasids when they conquered Egypt. So it's an Abbasid administration in the 10th century. The Fatimids come in 969, and who's going to collect the taxes? Well, probably it's going to be the same people who are collecting the taxes before. So that's kind of one problem that they have to contend with. Okay, so I'm going to say, well, no, that's all I'll say now about decrees. So that's to give you a sense of how is the state actually communicating in a kind of broadcast way in writing. But now I want to shift gears and talk about communication in the other direction. How are subjects communicating with the state? So the way subjects are communicating with the state is through the act of petitioning. So writing a petition, explaining a problem, and asking for some kind of redress. So for the decrees that I just showed you, there's complete continuity between Abbasid decrees and Fatimid decrees. For petitioning, what the Fatimids are doing is totally new. So let me just walk you through that sort of briskly. This is the earliest Arabic document that can be classified as a petition. It's a letter from the last pre-Islamic prince of Sogdiana in Central Asia. This was excavated by Soviet archaeologists in the early 1930s. And it's a letter written to the Umayyad Arab emir who was keeping this prince under house arrest and was about to abolish his kingdom. Okay, so you have to imagine you're the last, prince of Sogdiana, and you're under house arrest, and you're communicating with your captors by writing a petition, except that you speak Sogdian, you don't speak Arabic, so you need a scribe, a bilingual scribe who can come and write this letter for you. So this prince is in an abject state that's about to become even more abject. The petition is seemingly mundane because he's requesting a pair of riding animals from the postal service. And then if you look at the other documents that were excavated in the same, at the same site, it turns out that he probably needed these riding animals in order to ferry his children into exile because he knew that, his days were numbered. So seemingly mundane, but actually quite momentous. Like he really needs these riding animals. And so you'd think that he or his scribes would make an effort to produce a kind of fancy and convincing petition. So in fact, they have made an effort because they're writing in Arabic, they're not writing in Sogdian. The script is a bit grand for its time. However, if you look at the actual verbal formulary of this petition, there's virtually nothing petition-like about it. This is simply a letter. It's a standard issue letter. It looks like a letter. It has the diplomatics of a letter, except for a single clause, which is a request softener. So this is what I talk about in chapter 8 as a ra'i clause, which is basically, let me explain my problem, let me ask for a request, and then, however, the lofty opinion in this matter belongs to you, meaning I would really like you to do this, but ultimately it's your choice because you're the boss. So physically, this is no different from other formal letters written in Arabic at the time. It's a typical Umayyad era letter in every way, except for this one clause, which is a petition clause. Okay, so that's a petition to a Muslim governor in Central Asia, and it's quite an early one. What about petitions to the Abbasid governors of Egypt, right? Because we're in Central Asia now, so now let's look at Egypt. So here, things get even more interesting. This is a petition to a very famous Abbasid governor of Egypt, Ahmed ibn Tulun. So Ibn Tulun is famous because he had the temerity to rule independently of Baghdad, of the Abbasids, to insist on keeping Egypt's tax revenue in Egypt. And it's unbelievable that a petition to him has survived. It's even more unbelievable to me that it's in the Princeton University Library. It has not yet been published. It's not easy to read. The chroniclers tell us that Ibn Tulun was the first ruler of Islamic Egypt to hear petitions himself, as opposed to kicking them upstairs to the caliphs in Baghdad. And he heard petitions himself because he styled himself a defender of the weak. So you might think that a petition to Ibn Tulun would look really impressive. But in fact, this petition does not look impressive at all. It's just a plain old Arabic letter on papyrus, again, with that single clause, the ra'i clause, that alerts you to the fact that it's a petition. In other words, petitions up until the end of the 9th century had not yet emerged as their own genre of text, not even when they were directed to governors, or even when they were addressed to caliphs. And that is the thing that the Fatimids would change. For the Fatimids, the petition would emerge as its own particular genre of writing, and that had to do with their philosophy of rule. Under the Fatimids, petitions started to look like decrees. So what I'm showing you now is a Fatimid petition. It's a late Fatimid petition, but I could have shown you an example from the 1020s that looks more or less the same. In this particular case, it's to the Fatimid vizier, and it is a request to pay back a private debt in installments. In other words, it doesn't get more mundane than this. And yet, this petition looks very much like a Fatimid decree in the following ways. First of all, like Fatimid decrees, it has a wide top margin and a wide right-hand margin, but little to no margin on the left-hand side. Also, so there's a particular thing called a tarjama, which is where you write your name, you as the petitioner. So the tarjama is consistently on the upper left side in Fatimid petitions. That's something that's different from the decree. It's written in that same curvilinear script that I was describing to you of the decrees. There are like fun things that you can do by measuring the angles of the baseline and the words. So there are all kinds of, it's clear that there's something sort of deliberate going on because of the consistent angles at which the words are actually arranged on the page between the decrees and the petitions. There is the wide line spacing that you have in the decrees, except for the invocation of God. This is the Basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And when you write this, you actually don't do the wide line spacing. And that is also true of decrees. You have the same boat-shaped lines that curve slightly downward and then markedly upward with the stacking of words at the ends of lines. In other words, there are all of these diplomatic features that Fatimids are importing from the decree to the petition. And the question is, why are they doing that? What is so important about the petition that they suddenly make it look like a much more elaborate kind of document? So in the book, in the first chapter that you read, I argue that the reason they did this, or let's say the first evidence that we have that they're thinking about running their administration this way, comes from the period just before the conquest of Egypt. In the 940s and 950s, the Fatimids had actually made a couple of different attempts to conquer Egypt and failed both times. So in the 950s, they begin to plan very, very carefully their third attempt on Egypt, ultimately the successful one. And one of the ways that they planned was by so the Fatimid Caliph appointed his chief qadi, whose name was Na'man, to write essentially an administrative manual. So how do you run a state? So they're thinking about remaking the administration because they know they're going to be running a territory that's going to be very, very different in scope, size, and complexity from what they've been doing so far. So Al-Qadi Nauman obliges. He writes this this work. There's a very complicated textual history, but ultimately the main version that we have has come down to us as a book called The Pillars of Islam, probably finished around 957. And there's a section in this work where Qadi Nauman talks about how the rulers should interact with the tax-paying peasants. So I'm just going to bring you a few snippets from the work. First, the conduct in which the ruler should engage is that which best ensures the satisfaction of the common people. Now, you read this amiable work and you think, oh, that's such nice rhetoric. I'm sure the caliphs didn't really care about the common people, but nice that they're pretending to. But actually, there's something a little bit deeper happening here. So another quotation: the resentment of the common people destroys the satisfaction of the elite, while the resentment of the elite can be endured when there is the satisfaction of the common people. So now you start to get a sense that maybe there's some self-interest at stake, right? We want to make the common people happy because ultimately it's the only way to make ourselves happy, right? See that the people suffer no injustice from yourself, from your family, or from your retainers. If you do not act in this way, you are guilty of oppression. So there are paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs on what is injustice and what constitutes oppression and how you should avoid oppressing the people. Reasons not given, doesn't say whether it's for pragmatic reasons or ethical reasons, but oppression is to be avoided. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you actually keep the people happy? Especially the people who are going to be filling the fisc with tax revenue. So how do you keep your land tax paying subjects happy? Some solutions that Al-Qadi Nauman proposes: call together those who pay the land tax from each locality and bid them make known to you the conditions in their localities, their welfare therein, and the state of their land. In other words, hold audiences, find out what's going on in the territory. Maintain the so here I'm paraphrasing, maintain the agricultural infrastructure on which the productivity of taxpayers depends, especially irrigation canals. Allow them to complain to you about a heavy tax burden, or about cutting off irrigation water, or about the ruining of the soil by inundation, or a drought, or some devastating plague. In other words, if they have problems, you need to create the conditions where they can tell you about their problems, and then you need to help them alleviate their burden. Okay, and then this is there's pages and pages on taxation, which I love. Love taxation. But one of the things that Al-Qadi Nauman is very, very careful to say is, if people are going to be collecting taxes from these peasants, you need to systematize the skills involved in collecting taxes and make it a technical, make tax collection a technical activity in order to minimize the possibility of some local honcho coming along and just demanding tax money. In other words, there needs to be a bureaucracy. Okay, another problem. Okay, great. We're going to have taxes that get collected in a technical way so that things are systematized and bureaucratic. But the problem is, who actually knows how to collect the taxes? It's the Abbasid officials who we're about to displace. So what do we do about that? The fact that these technical skills are to be found among officials of the old regime. So the Qadi Nauman doesn't really like the officials of the old regime. What he says about them is, the worst among, so he's talking to the caliph now, the worst among your confidants and viziers are those who used to be confidants and viziers of the wicked, by which he means the Abbasids, who participated in their crimes and rendered them service. They're the companions of tyrants and the aides of criminals. They're like ravening wolves. So what do we do about the problem that we don't trust the Abbasid officials because by our lights, they're corrupt and oppressive? The solution: set up a sovereign court of complaints where anyone can come and petition you about the oppression imposed on them by these local officials. In other words, continue to use Abbasid officials, but minimize their chances of oppressing people and of being disloyal to the Fatimids by allowing people to complain about their behavior. So that's the context in which you begin to get a proliferation of petitions to the Fatimid caliphs and viziers. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this looks like in reality. So in the early 1020s, so in 1021, the Caliph al-Hakim disappears. He dies, or maybe he's, assumed to into occultation. Nobody, nobody knows. But the problem is that his successor is only 9 years old. So in this period of his successor's minority, the state is ruled by his half-sister, Sitt al-Mulk. So people will tell you, in Islamic history, there aren't female rulers. That's not exactly true. They did not bear the title of caliph, but in this case, we have somebody who has all of the privileges and forms of address of a vizier, and she is a woman. So we have a petition to her from somebody in the Fayoum in Egypt. And the meat of the petition is, so this is the guy's problem. I gave my son 100 dinars, that's a lot of money, and sent him to Medina to Fayoum to buy wheat or barley there for us to eat. There had been a low Nile the previous year, so people are getting nervous about famine and running low on stores. So he sends his son to go and buy wheat for the humans and barley for the animals. And then, he says, the news reached me that my son had bought 70 sacks of wheat and given them over to my lord the governor, Abu Muhammad al-Hassan ibn Thiqat al-Dawla, may God prolong his power. So this is a very delicate phrasing. He's not saying the governor confiscated my grain, but that's basically what happened, is the governor made off with the guy's grain. He's being kind of delicate about it, but he's writing a petition to Sitt al-Mulk saying, can you please get my grain back? Send a eunuch to the district governor to take a decree from him releasing the sacks of wheat as soon as they reach Giza, so I can get my property back. Okay, so this is how this works in reality, is you have this guy who's writing to the highest authority in the state and saying, there's a local official who is taking my property. Can you please get it back from me? And oh, by the way, you need to sack this guy because he's corrupt. The theory behind this is something that would get written about quite a bit in the later Middle Ages, and especially in the Ottoman period, that scholars today refer to as the circle of justice, although sometimes it's really an octagon of justice. And the way the circle of justice works is there can be no sovereign power without being supported by military force. So states, have to monopolize the legitimate means of coercion, as Weber told us. But there can be no military force without tax revenue, because somebody's got to pay the army and buy material and so forth. But there can be no tax revenue without the prosperity of subjects. So how do you make subjects prosperous? So we have circles of justice that predate the Fatimids, but the Fatimid circle of justice that Al-Qadi Nauman composes is the first one, to the best of my knowledge, the first one in the Arabic tradition that says subjects will only prosper when you give them justice. Al-Qadi Nauman introduces this link between prosperity and justice, where he's saying all the things that I told you about in his manual, that you have to listen to people and you have to make it possible for them to petition you under any circumstances. Okay, so just to kind of like recap the reasons behind petitioning. The Fatimids want their subjects to petition because they regard themselves as protectors of the weak. They also want to keep their lower officials in check. They also realize there's a kind of practical effect of this, which is that they will receive tax revenue by keeping people happy. So tax in exchange for justice. And they also feel themselves to have an ethical obligation to protect the weak. In other words, the Fatimids encouraged petitioning for reasons that were simultaneously practical and ethical. And I make no claims about the relative importance of these motives for the Fatimids, but they all seem to have been present, and different writers gave them different emphases at different times. Either way, investing in the petition and response process was the single answer to the two most important questions that the Fatimids faced when they conquered Egypt. One, what do we do with the Abbasid bureaucrats that we find when we get to Egypt? They probably won't like us, but we need them because they have local knowledge and we don't. But local knowledge means that they can also embezzle behind our backs and we might never know about it. So how do we find out about it? Petitioning is the answer, because any ordinary subject can complain to us about the corruption of local officials. The second answer the Fatimids, or the second question that the Fatimids faced when they conquered Egypt is, how can we convince the subjects, right, that we find there, that we're on their side and that they should therefore willingly pay their taxes? We'll convince them by encouraging them to confide in us and to turn to us for protection. So 200 years later, you have a head of the Fatimid Chancery named Ibn Sayrafi, who gives his own take on the theory of petitioning. He says, so he's writing a manual for Chancery officials. He's actually writing to his somewhat megalomaniacal boss, the vizier, trying to convince him that he's the guy who should continue to head the Chancery. And so he says, here's how things work. And one of the things that we do here in the Chancery is we write rescripts or decrees in response to petitions, especially petitions concerning grievances. This aspect of issuing decrees is an important matter for many reasons, since it involves people claiming just treatment from one another and the establishment of justice in the realm. Also, most of those with a grievance are powerless people, paupers, and women without patrons. This is like a theme in the literature. Women without patrons are kind of like the weakest of the weak. So, they don't have brothers, husbands, fathers, uncles to represent them. Women alone, we, the state, we're going to step in and be their patrons. And you actually see this. So there are Jewish women who, when they can't get what they want from a rabbinical court, in the 11th and 12th century, will actually threaten to go to the state, because the women know that if they can't get what they want from the rabbinical courts, the state will give it to them, and the rabbis don't like that. So it's kind of the ultimate sort of legal, legal argument. Most of whom arrive from distant parts of the realm, believing that they're approaching someone who will help them and redress their grievances and assist them against their adversaries. So I'm going to, just in the interest of time, go very, very briefly, show you very briefly a few more petitions, but basically the point I want to make is that they almost all have to do with property. Sometimes they're property disputes between subjects, sometimes they're property disputes between subjects and officials. So in this case, there's an inheritance that's being petitioned about. In this case, there's a legal dispute between two Jews about a debt, and it seems to be the official who's writing to try and get this worked out with the vizier. In this case, there's a Jewish merchant who's on his way back from India and Yemen, and his cargo gets impounded, and he's supposed to pay a tax on it that he already had filed papers demonstrating that he's not supposed to pay these taxes. So he's asking for redress from the oppression of the local official who has impounded his property. And in this case, there's a woman who's seeking restitution of money that was taken from either her or her husband. So you get the idea of what these petitions actually look like. Okay, the final point I want to make before engaging in discussion and hearing your questions is the centrality of petitioning as a means of maintaining good relations with subjects. It's something that Jews are very much aware of. They are absolutely delighted to use these means that are given to them in order to further the interests of merchants, the interests of individuals, but also the interests of the community. So when there are sort of high-level disputes that happen among the communal leadership, they will often petition the state for support for one side or the other. And one of the results of this is that the language of petitioning and of the issuing of decrees in response to petitions pervades the Hebrew script documentation from the Geniza. So this is a letter that was produced in the course of a dispute between two communal officials in 1038. One high communal official writes about another high communal official who he doesn't like very much. Then the son of the man from Fez, this is actually the Gaon of Jerusalem, who's the head of the Jewish community of the Fatimid Empire, but he calls him the son of the man from Fez, he's being somewhat contemptuous, came from Damascus with a rescript to the Jewish community saying that the abominations were spreading, whatever, we don't have to get into the details. So in other words, the Gaon has actually gone and gotten himself a rescript from a local official, Fatimid official in Damascus, because he knows that's the way to make his claim in front of other Jewish officials who are trying to oust him from his office. Here's a more sort of mundane letter. This is from a trader who says, you know, something, something, something by means of the legal decision granted to me in an exalted rescript. And the term he uses is a technical term meaning a state decree. Here's another document of complaint, in this case to a communal official, saying, you know, this guy is being incredibly disloyal to me, and I don't understand why, because I even arranged for him a rescript canceling his capitation tax. So the point there being that the language of petition and of rescript is pervasive, and these letters, Jews are very much aware of it. But not only are they aware of the vocabulary of petition and decree, they're also aware of the diplomatics of it. So this is the same petition that I was showing you before, making the point about how petitions look like decrees. So watch and see what happens to Jewish communal documentation. So when the leaders of the Jewish community receive petitions and write responses to petitions in Hebrew script from people in the Jewish community, they start to make their documents look like Fatimid petitions and decrees as well. This is a petition to the first Jewish community officials who bore the title Rais el-Yahud, the head of the Jews, which is an office that arose in the 1060s in Fatimid Cairo. So this is it's quite remarkable because it's a petition and it actually looks like a Fatimid petition. The only difference is that it's in Hebrew script and it's not written to a Fatimid official, it's written to a Jewish communal official. So you have the large upper margins and a larger right-hand margin than left-hand margin. You have, obviously curvilinear script doesn't apply, and the Tarjuma has not been preserved in this case at the upper left, although we have petitions that do use the Tarjuma at the upper left. You have the wide line spacing, except at the invocation of God. So this invocation of God is not Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, it's Bishmah Rahmana, which is a Aramaic calque of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is like another sort of, you know, wacky co-production moment. So you have the wide line spacing except at the invocation of God. And you even have an attempt to reproduce those gondola-shaped lines with stacking of words at the ends of lines, just like you have in the Arabic script Fatimid petitions. Amazingly, these elements of Fatimid documentation appear in the Jewish community documentation in petitions before they appear in decrees. So there's somebody in the Jewish community who's like, well, if I'm going to write a petition or have my scribe write a petition, let's make it look like an official Fatimid petition before the Jewish communal officials, these heads of the Jews, actually come along and say, oh, you know what, if we're going to write a decree, let's make it look like a real decree. There's also just like the funny fact that this petition is written on the back of a dismembered Fatimid decree. So clearly whoever's writing it is aware of how state documents look. There's also some verbal formula that appears in that document that I won't go into, that's taken right from the Fatimid decree. So here's another petition written in more or less the same period. And here finally, in the next generation of heads of the Jews, you get the decrees that start to look more like Fatimid decrees. So, oh yeah, I just want to make one final point, which is that this isn't limited to Jews. In the 13th century, Christians start to do this too. So this is a decree, sorry, this is a petition on the right-hand side written to a Coptic patriarch by members of the Coptic Church. And when the Coptic patriarch responds to the petition, he responds in a way that looks exactly like a Fatimid and then later Ayyubid and Mamluk decree, with this large signature at the top and the decree written on the back of the petition. So it seems that the methods of even internal communal administration are deeply influenced and affected by the way the Fatimids decide to represent themselves as being protectors of the weak and purveyors of justice, down to the level of how they write their documents. Okay, I am looking forward to your questions. I will end the slideshow.
Thank you, Marina. I feel like I've taken, so Marina, I think I've taken, while I was in residence, I think I took every course you offered, and you were also on my dissertation committee, and yet every time you give a talk, I feel like I'm being exposed to a brand new ocean of knowledge. So this has been really incredible. So for questions, you can, those of you, okay, so you can either use the raise hand function, or you can just text me in the chat, and I will write your names down in an ongoing list. And then I too have a couple of questions that I will plug in somewhere in the middle, but I don't want to hold you back. So Aysun, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. It was very informative. I have a question concerning the pragmatic side of your research. How easy or difficult was it to get access to respective documents and archive material in Cairo, Egypt? Yeah, this is my question because I have the feeling when I ask archives in Turkey or in Egypt to get access there, yeah, they are not so open in giving access. What were your experiences? Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It is not easy to get archival access in Egypt. First of all, you actually have to be approved and get an archive permit. But even once you do that, it's often the case that you'll go and you'll ask for a particular document that you know exists because you've seen it cited in the literature, because you've seen a reproduction of it in some 19th century work, and they'll tell you, I'm sorry, that doesn't exist. So so it's an issue. And the issue, I think, is partly organizational, in the sense that there is simply so much material. And it's not always so well organized, and it's certainly not nearly thoroughly digitized. I think Turkey is very different from Egypt in that respect. I mean, I'm thinking now of, there's a really important cache of manuscripts that's Geniza-like, that was from the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, the Qubad al-Khazna, and we're talking about a kind of similar amount of material, about 200,000 fragments, almost all of which are now in Istanbul at the Museum of Islamic Art. And those, in fact, are accessible. They're not thoroughly digitized yet, but I do have colleagues who are working with that cache quite successfully. With the Egyptian material, it also depends a bit what you're looking for. So different eras, I think, are more accessible than others. The Fatimid material in particular, there just hasn't been enough interest in it. So it's not the kind of thing where the Egyptian authorities have the sense that, oh, this is in demand, and historians actually want to look at it, because for them, the show stealer is always the pharaonic material, and then maybe after that, the Roman material. But for the Fatimid material, I have not had good luck with that, and ditto for colleagues and students of mine.
George, go ahead. George.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Marina. This is really great. I have two comments. The first one is really anecdotal, and it has to do with the cover image of your book, just showing that writing tradition persisted, at least in some societies, up to the 20th century. In the late 1900s, early 2000s, I was visiting a prolific writer in India. His name was Kurian Kanyamparampil. He was almost 100 years old at the time. And he was boasting of how much he was writing, pointing to his knee and how his knee hurts from all this writing. And on your image, the scribes are writing on the knee. The second one is actual data. So just comparing, you had that chart of the language script, and it's really interesting that in the Mardin archive of the Syriac Orthodox Church, and that's a much later archive from the 1900s, the numbers almost like match your numbers. The vast majority of texts are Arabic in the Syriac script, like, Gershuni, and then you get to Arabic script texts. And then in the middle, we have Ottoman as well. But then again, first Ottoman Gershuni, then Ottoman script, and then all the way at the bottom, you have Syriac. And, something is happening, I guess, maybe with the sociolinguistic ecosystem of these communities losing their liturgical language. And even though, Aramaic was spoken, well beyond the period where Hebrew was spoken, but by the time we get to the 1900s, the numbers are really matching yours.
That's totally fascinating. I hope you send me your pie chart. I know you have the data and the data skills. But I also just want to point out that if I were to make that same pie chart for the entire Geniza, not just the documentary Geniza, the proportion of Hebrew material would actually increase, I assume, right? Because that's where we get lots of liturgical manuscripts and biblical manuscripts. I think something like, a quarter of the Cambridge Geniza collection, which is probably representative of the whole, is just liturgical poetry in Hebrew, right? And liturgical poetry in Hebrew is like its whole own thing. First of all, because if you're a cantor in the 11th and 12th century, you're expected to compose liturgical poetry every week, right? So there's a lot of it that's being written, and those guys are some of the most desperate for writing material. So it's really fun to talk to my colleagues who work on PUs on liturgical poetry, because they often have state documents on the back and send them to me. But all of that is in Hebrew. I mean, to the point where it's actually the discovery of all this liturgical poetry in the Geniza has sort of revolutionized the history of the Hebrew language. You have like vocabulary that you can't even like figure out what it means. Like, it's very, very difficult and challenging material. So that's 25% of the whole Geniza, and that's just the liturgical poetry. Now I'm not even talking about the Bible manuscripts. So in a sense, it stands to reason that you wouldn't have as many documents in Hebrew, which is a classical language that nobody's speaking at the time. At the same time, there are quite a few letters that I read in Hebrew where it's like, leaders of the Jewish community who are trying to sound very impressive by writing their official letters in Hebrew, right? So it is fascinating sociolinguistically in terms of like, what are you trying to project? And also, how are you trying to represent yourself?
And then, George, I think you had mentioned you had a second comment.
I gave both. The first was the image, and the second was the linguistic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Amina, you can go ahead.
Okay. Hi, good evening. Thank you very much, Marina, for your fantastic presentation, as always. I have a question about Arabic scripts, because it's very strange how you explain the presence of Arabic scripts in documents of Geniza Cairo. How you explain this? Because we know there is competition between Arabic scripts and the Hebrew scripts. How explain this big presence?
Yeah, so couple of things. We know that Jews are writing in Arabic script as well as Hebrew script. Arabic script seems to have been a more advanced topic. So if you were, kind of like educated at the elementary level, the script that you learned was Hebrew script. But if you continued your education beyond the elementary level, then you learned Arabic script. And one of the most fascinating ways of trying to sort of track what is the relationship of Jews to Arabic script is looking at bialphabetic letters. So often Jews will actually switch alphabets right in the middle of a sentence. Now, people do this in long form literary works. There are Bible commentaries that switch alphabets right in the middle of a line. You expect that of people who are well educated enough that they're writing biblical commentaries, right? But if you look at sort of the slightly low, sub-elite levels of writing, even there you see this kind of switching, this code switching between Hebrew and Arabic script, and that gives you a sense of like what are the specific phrases that just naturally are coming to people's hand in Arabic script. And many of them are the kind of formulaic phrases that you use in letters, like blessings after names. So for example, there's a Gaon of Baghdad named Shmuel ben Hofni, who writes a letter in the early 11th century to somebody in Egypt. And the entire thing is in Judeo-Arabic. It's all in Hebrew script, except where he blesses the guy. He you'll say like, so I'm writing to you, may God preserve you, right? So the phrase is Ayyadahullah. And whenever he writes Ayyadahullah, he writes it in Arabic script, but the whole rest of the letter is in Hebrew script. So clearly there's some kind of like an epistolary, habit or education that he's had where that's the thing that's coming out in Arabic script. So I think in order to answer your question, we'd have to look at the bialphabetic letters more than looking even at the documents that are just in Arabic script. But that said, I mean, like I said, that statistic was really surprising even to me. So I think this really requires a lot more study. I do just want to give a caveat to that, which is if we take seriously the fact that much of what we call the Cairo Geniza actually comes from other sources, we also have to be prepared for the possibility that some of this material doesn't actually come from the Jewish community. So that's another question, right? If we could somehow filter that pie chart that I showed you for documents that have a kind of demonstrated relationship to members of the Jewish community, maybe it would look different. But that's research that has yet to be done.
So one question emerging kind of from the postdoc conversations that we've had is this question of kind of establishing and proving causality in the face of incomplete or asymmetric information, which I know is something we've talked a lot about. And I love how you think about it. But that's something where, we've, as postdocs, some of us are doing social history, some of us are doing more kind of textual diachronic history. And there's this element of, when you're studying, whether it's communication between state elites and the lay population or between different religious communities, oftentimes you'll have this phenomenon of quite a bit of documentation on one end of that communication, one end of that relationship and not quite so much on the other. And so kind of talk to us a little bit about how you think about that. Because that's something that I think the postdocs have been really thinking about and struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, it really completely depends on the kind of documentation that you're dealing with, exactly as you suggest. This is actually one of the reasons that I got so interested in state documents and started, 10 years ago, like trying to teach myself how to read them and trying to find more and more of them. Because I had basically been trained as a Judeo-Arabist. I hadn't been trained in Arabic paleography, and all of that was completely new to me. But the idea that you could kind of document both sides of the relationship. So on the one hand, why is the state actually bothering to listen to its subjects, and what does the state expect from this communication channel? And then on the other hand, how is this actually affecting members of the Jewish community themselves? that was kind of that meeting point where I was like, okay, this has to be looked at. And I wasn't necessarily expecting to find very clear causality in terms of influence, except then I did. Specifically, I started to get really interested in like, well, what, you know, once I started looking at decrees and petitions from the Fatimids, I was like, well, what do the decrees and petitions look like in the Jewish community? I was reading Mark Cohen's first book from 1980, where he talks about the origins of the office of head of the Jews, of Ra'is Yehud. And he talks about decrees and petitions in the community. And like my ears pricked up, and I was like, oh, decrees and petitions, I guess I should really look at those. This was before digital images were like, you know, widely available. So I spent like a few months trying to gather as many of these as I could. And then I started noticing the ones with the wide line spacing. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then when I started looking more closely at the dating, I realized that it was a particular moment when Jews actually turned to the Fatimid style. So essentially, it's the early 1060s. So before the 1060s, there's lots and lots of communal documentation, but none of it looks like that Fatimid stuff. And then two things happen in the 1060s. The first thing is, actually a little bit before, in the late 1050s. The first thing is that a guy comes from Iraq named Daniel ben Azariah, who assumes the Gaonate of Jerusalem. So it's weird because you have an Iraqi who is the Jerusalem Gaon, and he's somebody who you see writing letters in this very, very wide line spacing, probably because he'd been kind of steeped in this world of Abbasid and post-Abbasid document production. So that's the first thing that happens. But that's happening in Palestine. The second thing that happens is that in Cairo itself, in the early 1060s, you have these two brothers, actually three brothers, who are slowly amassing the prerogatives that would enable the establishment of this office of head of the Jews. And it's not even like they're the ones imposing this Fatimid-like behavior, you know, on the rest of the community. It's that people are petitioning them with more and more Fatimid style petitions. So it's like 100 years after the Fatimids come to Egypt and kind of establish this petition and response procedure as being like one of the centerpieces of their political philosophy. The Jews kind of are like, well, we can use that too, right? So it's really, you know, I don't expect to find such clear causality, but it got to the point where I was super excited because I was like, well, if you find an undated letter in Hebrew script that has super wide line spacing and stacking of words at the ends of lines, there's a pretty good chance that it postdates 1060, right? Then you get these like, you know, these extra benefits from doing this kind of close study of causality. So I would say the place to begin with trying to do that is like, where can you find that intersection, right, of both sides of the relationship, where you can really kind of understand the motives and the procedures on both sides.
Great, thank you. That is so helpful. Maureen, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And my question is closely related to the one Sarah just asked. Because while listening to you and to the last part of your talk, I was remembering the discourse and member of the Collegium about a precise definition of co-production. And I was wondering, how do we distinguish co-production from imitation? Because in your talk, what I understood, and it was quite fascinating, is that Jews took an administrative petition practice from the Fatimid court and ended up using them in their own dealings with their own Jewish court, even in another language. And it's really a question that I want to ask everyone, actually. Is that enough for us to consider that co-production when it's taken from one social practice with, let's say, two interacting communities, taken from that into internally to one community, another one? Will we consider that co-production, or will we consider that integration, imitation? because what I am focusing right now, and I think a lot of us are, is trying to make co-production not too wide and trying to pinpoint exactly the criteria for co-production. So this is what I wanted to ask, but actually everyone, I think. Thank you.
I'd love to hear from everyone on this too. I think you're better situated to answer this question than I am.
Well, I think it kind of relates to this question of providing some context for what Maureen was just asking. We had a seminar 2 weeks ago, or was it 4 weeks ago, in Bern, and we were talking about how do we best typologize co-production. We have different dynamics, right? Communicative dynamics. In some cases, we see a pattern or practice being wholly adopted by another community. In other cases, we see this back and forth. And in yet other instances, we see the denial of a practice being absorbed, yet it being used anyways. And so then the question becomes, do we want to in what ways do we want to typologize these interactions and separate them from each other as different categories of co-production, instead of calling all of it interaction that's affecting both communities, if that makes sense. And I'm adding on, Maureen, to what you were mentioning, I'm even thinking in the context of Geniza studies, we see, for example, and I'm thinking about Uriel Simonson's work and Jessica Goldberg and a few others, we see kind of the usage of these words like semi-autonomous communities or overlapping realms of authority, or even the double gaze. And so, I think this is, it's going to be, I feel like this is something that we probably just have to keep thinking about, because it's hard to ask, Marina, it's hard to ask you to answer this question, or to, ask anyone to answer this question. But there are these subtle differences, I feel like, when we're talking about interactions, and how do we kind of think about the next step in typologizing them. I think that's kind of a more general version of Maureen's question. Maybe Maureen, correct me if I'm wrong. But if you have thoughts, Marina, go ahead. And if anyone else has thoughts, feel free to raise your hand or text me in the chat as well if you'd like to add.
I mean, I'll just throw this out in case it's helpful. When I'm talking about members of the Jewish community on the one hand and the Fatimid state on the other, we're talking both about an asymmetrical relationship and also about an asymmetrical quantity of information, Sarah, like you said earlier. So in the case of the Jewish community, we're really fortunate to be able to kind of track the fluctuations of Jewish communal administration over time, really decade by decade, because we have so much documentation. And that's kind of like, how you can do it from the Jewish side. From the Fatimid state side, it's a bit more challenging, because there's a kind of black box effect where we have these documents, petitions being written to the state and decrees going out from the state. We also have internal state documentation, but is it really appropriate for us to talk about that as being part of this kind of co-production equation, right? So I think this is part of Maureen's question, is like, we can see that the Fatimid style is influencing Jewish communal administration, but to what extent do Jews have a hand in also producing the Fatimid state? So there, I think you could make maybe half of an argument about the petition and response procedure, right? In other words, in order for the Fatimids to kind of style themselves like the protectors of the oppressed actually have to be willing, right, to turn to the Fatimids for help. So, but these are really very, very broad strokes. So I do think you can probably, it would be worthwhile working to make the category of co-production, as precise as possible, because what I've just done is actually very kind of baggy. So yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Rustow. This is a really informative and engaging presentation. And I have, I suppose, a comment following up on Marie's question, but I think what you just said really is, or parallels something I've been thinking about over the course of your talk and the Q&A, which is the question to me is not necessarily that whether or not imitation is a form of co-production. And I think our arguments can be made either for or against that. But for me, one question I was pondering was the extent to which this is religious co-production or not. And you started your talk by noting how your book is really not about religion in particular. And I think that tracked for me as you presented a really wide range of evidence. And I was particularly struck by your mentioning of Weber, because when you were discussing the Fatimid insistence on bureaucracy as a form of avoiding corruption, and particularly as a form of avoiding corruption when you're having to co-opt an administration that was loyal to another destiny, that I was thinking about Weber in that context before you mentioned Weber, and to me, and Weber talks about bureaucracy really as in the modern European context as something in tandem with secularization or the demystification of government, where you move away from the sort of like divine right of kings, or that God is sort of in control of the welfare of these communities. And I was struck by the absence of religious language in these manuals for government, where it's not really, and again, at least the portions that you mentioned didn't really have this religious emphasis. So I guess the question that I would pose to you and to the group would be whether or not this is a moment to think about the limits of religious co-production, where I think by the very act of framing this discussion as Muslim communities living in Jewish communities living in Muslim dominant settings, or Christian communities living in Muslim dominant settings, like as soon as we set it up that way, I think we there's a danger of expanding the reach of what is religious and what is not, to the point where religion is everything, and if religion's everything, it's nothing. So is this really just a case of not necessarily interactions and inner influences between Jews and Muslims, but rather is it better to frame it as interaction between taxpayers and tax collectors, or state agents and the people that they're governing? So that's one question I would pose, and then I have another question that's unrelated, but you in the pie chart of the different languages that you had, there were certain designations that I was intrigued by, one of which was you had Judeo-Arabic, Arabic. And I was wondering, is that a reference to texts that are written in Arabic and then transliterated into Judeo-Arabic?
No, it's that code switching that I talked about, where they're writing in both scripts and switching. So all of the slivers of the pie chart that have more than one language listed, it's because more than one language is actually appearing in the document. So your first question is really interesting. It's certainly true that the thing that got me out of bed in the morning when I was writing this book is I really wanted to understand the relationship between state and society. And I thought, okay, we actually have like an opportunity to do this because you can document both sides of the relationship. But if I were, if you asked me like, okay, now like sit down and write a paper on co-production, what I would actually write about is I would write about legal documents, about court documents. because court documents they're super, super interesting. And they're interesting because they're essentially like the scribes who are writing these court documents. I mean, I'm talking about, like deeds, marriage contracts, settlements of debts, things like that. The scribes who are writing them are like chefs who have a bunch of ingredients in front of them, and they're using them in ways that, depending on how experienced they are, can be very creative. So they're not sitting there with like a book, like here's how you write, a real estate deed, and then copying. They have like, the index cards in their head of different bits of formula, and they can mix and match. And some of my colleagues, in particular, Jeffrey Kahn and now Eve Krakowski, have done some amazing work trying to document the development of these formulary, kind of ingredients over time. And what's fascinating is that you can actually see embedded in the 11th and 12th century legal documents for both Jews and Muslims. So we're talking about both Arabic script documents that are meant to be used in Qadi court proceedings on the one hand, and then rabbinical courts on the other. You can see elements of Greek formulary translated into, in one case, Aramaic, and in the other case, Arabic. You can see some bits of like ancient Aramaic formula that certainly is embedded in the Jewish documents, but also there are some like echoes in certain phraseologies and certain structures in the Arabic documents. The example that I think really kind of, brought this home to Eve and me, when Eve Krakowski and I, when we were writing an article together back in 2014, is a piece of formula from a Jewish marriage contract that we know about because the scribe wrote out a draft of this marriage contract, and then at the top, on like a scrap of parchment, so this is clearly a draft, and on the top he wrote a note to the Ra'is al-Yahud, to the head of the Jews, like basically his boss, saying, is it okay if I put this addition to the formula in because the couple is standing here and they need their contract? Okay, so what seems to have happened is that the couple's standing there and they're like, actually, can you insert that clause too? So what is this clause? Eve managed to trace this clause to Muslim marriage contracts. So what the scribe had done is he'd taken a piece of the Muslim marriage contract and translated it from Arabic to Aramaic, may I remind you, a dead language, right, at the time, but one that was actually the language for marriage documents. So you try to rabbinize this piece of formula by translating it to Aramaic, but actually what is it? It's from the Muslim formulary. These kinds of situations where you have legal formulary jumping the divide, either, between Karaites and Rabbinites, I wrote about that in my first book, or like across religions, that's where I would look. And the reason I would look there is we assume that these scribes who are writing like, a rabbinic legal document, right? We think these scribes are like the standing armies of the religion. They're the ones who are like laying down the boundaries. They're the ones who are like, let me write this legal document in such a way that like you could never get a legal document like this from like a Muslim notary. Like you can only get this here in the rabbinical courts. Like you think that that's really where they're kind of making these distinctions. But the more you start looking into the kind of bits of formulary, the fuzzier the boundaries actually begin to seem. Now, I explain this in pragmatic terms because basically these notaries are like, as desperate as anybody else. And they're like, okay, I got to get this done. Like, let me go, next door to my friend, the Muslim notary, and ask him like, do you have anything for this situation? Oh yeah, that's great. That'll work. Let me bring that over. And like, I wonder how we're going to do that. Oh, I'll just do it in Judeo-Arabic, right? So you see increasing amounts of Judeo-Arabic formulary entering Jewish legal documents over the course of the 11th century as the legal instruments become more and more complex. They're just doing it in the vernacular because like they can't translate everything to Hebrew and Aramaic. So that to me is fascinating because it suggests that we may have been looking at these legal traditions a little bit wrong, right? We think of law as being kind of like that's what structures the religion. That's what makes the religion the religion. But how is it really working on the ground when you look at the documents? Like, are things so clear?
Thank you. So we just have time for maybe 2 short questions. David, you go ahead, and then Frederica, you can go after him.
Sure. So I was wondering if you could talk like just a little bit more about the confessional politics of participating in the Fatimid state apparatus and its sort of discourse of petitionary justice. So there's this poet Al-Hassan ibn Bishr al-Damashqi who has this poem from the reign of Al-Aziz, so like late 10th century, where the first word of the poem is tanassar, meaning like convert to Christianity. And what he says after that is convert to Christianity, for Christianity is the right religion, or so this time of ours would seem to indicate. And as it turns out, he's being pissy about the fact that Christians are monopolizing all the best bureaucratic posts. And I mean, this has been noted a lot, but I think it is kind of interesting that a lot of different confessional groups have an easy time participating in sort of the discourse of petitionary justice that's built into the Fatimid state apparatus very successfully, despite the fact that if you asked like Qadi Numan, he would say, oh yeah, this is like a linear outgrowth of what the imam is supposed to do. This is al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi an al-munkar. Like, but you can participate in the discourse as a Christian or as a Jew without sort of conceding all of those claims. You can sort of use the same forms, you can use the same discourse. So it's definitely not a secular discourse, but it's not like a highly confessionalized discourse either. So what is it exactly? It's like not fully rationalized secular Weberian bureaucracy, but it's not that. Like, what is it?
Yeah. Well, okay, so let me just say for starters that I have a whole thing in the book on Weber, because the phenomena that Weber is describing in terms of the development of bureaucracy, I don't see that as being limited to either secular or secularizing contexts. I certainly don't see it as being limited to, like, Europe in the last 400 years. And so I would not make that link between bureaucracy on the one hand and the secular function of the state on the other. I don't think that's a necessary link. But in terms of the participation of non-Muslims in state officialdom, it's really fascinating. I mean, you're absolutely right, David, that people complain about it when it's to their advantage to complain about it. So you do have a couple of very like notorious, these things get quoted in like scholarship all the time, complaints about like how there are way too many Christians in the state bureaucracy, and in particular in the agrarian administration. But even Ibn Sayrafi, the chancery head from the mid 12th century who I quoted to you earlier, he also has a whole thing about like, the people around here, there are way too many Christians in the chancery, and so they respond to petitions from Christians only, right? Take that with a grain of salt. But this always confuses me, because when the Fatimids entered Egypt, there were more Christians than Muslims in Egypt. So of course the agrarian administration is going to be largely Christian, because like that's what Egypt was, right? So my sense is that there is definitely a pragmatics of this, and to say that there's a pragmatics of like, oh, we'll let anyone collect taxes who's capable of collecting taxes, is not to say that it's religion blind. On the contrary, the reason that there are more Christians than anyone else in the agrarian administration is that Christians are by and large a rural population. So you need people who actually, have access to, the villages and have the local knowledge. Ditto for Jews. There are plenty of Jewish tax farmers, but they're largely farming taxes from Jewish communities, right? So in other words, the Fatimids, like any pre-modern empire, they're stretched thin. The demographics are insane. Like the population of the planet Earth around the year 1000 is 300 million. It's like there are no people, right? Egypt has 5 million people in this period. So if you want to like try collecting taxes, I mean, you're just going to be spread thin all the time. And one way to make that easier for yourself as a state is to rely on existing local elites and local communities. And so you see that with Jews and Christians all the time. Now, there are Jews and Christians who also participate in the state, not as members of their community, but just as like, you know, generic officials. That happens as well. But that's a slightly different phenomenon, I think, from the one that you're asking about.
Frederica, go ahead. Last question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marina. I have a question on the adoption of the Fatimid-style diplomatics in Jewish and Christian communities. So in one of your last slides, you showed us that Christians also started using these kind of diplomatics for the petitions. And if I understood you correctly, you said it was in the 13th century. And what struck me as a bit odd is it, or maybe I didn't understand it correctly, is it the first attestation that we have, or do we have anything that is before that is different? So we can really say, okay, here we have the watershed moment where Christians also start to use that kind of diplomatics. So that's my first question on the adoption of Fatimid-style diplomatics in Christian circles. And then the other one that came up to my mind later on, when I already had raised my hand, is for how long were these kind of petition diplomatics used? Can we say anything about that?
Yes. So first of all, about the Coptic petition that I showed you, that is the earliest one that I happen to have an image of that I could show you, but it's not the first. At the same time, I'm not really the person to ask about this because I haven't done the thorough study of the Christian documentation that I've done of the Jewish documentation. I would really love to see more of that, and I hope that somebody is gonna work on that somewhere out there. And also, as I was making that point, I mean, I was conscious of the time, so I was compressing a little bit. It would be misleading, I think, at that point in the 13th century to say this is like Fatimid style diplomatics. What I mean is, this is the diplomatic style that the Fatimids introduced to Egypt, right? But if you look at the Ayyubid administration, the Ayyubids are the dynasty who come right after the Fatimids, there's complete continuity. Like, you look at an Ayyubid petition, an Ayyubid decree, it looks like a Fatimid one. And there's a reason for that, which is that all the people who are working the Ayyubid bureaucracy in Cairo were trained under the Fatimids, right? And then in the Mamluk period, the Mamluk administration preserved certain elements of that diplomatic style as well, like in those decrees I was showing you that al-Maqrizi reused in his notebook. So that leads to your second question. It's an incredibly long-lived style. So you have to separate between the wording on the one hand, which changes actually more rapidly than the graphic style. But this graphic style of curvilinear script and upward curving lines and stacking of words at the ends of lines lasts all the way down to the 20th century. If you think about, like, you've probably seen lots of Ottoman firmans in, museums and stuff, and maybe if you're lucky, even in archives, they have that look, but it's simply just a more exaggerated version of the same thing. The Tuhra, the big, sultanic signature, that has precedence in some of the 10th century documents that I was researching for my book. And that was the amazing part to me, is how, just the longevity of this form of communication because of what it represents, right? So there had been all these statements in the literature about ultimately this is an Abbasid style, but what does that really mean? Do we really have evidence of that? But I do think that there was a kind of consciousness, why does the style last so long? Because it's seen as ultimately coming from this moment of unity and legitimacy in, the 10th century Abbasid Empire. I mean, the irony is that the people who are writing on behalf of the style in the 930s and 940s are about to start working for, the Buyids, who are kind of ending this moment of Abbasid unity. But there's, in terms of what is this representing? It's representing the power of the state to speak with this kind of, theocratic voice, right? And I think that's part of the reason that it lasts so long. It's also something that you see at the upper echelons of the administration, more than the lower echelons of the administration, which I think is also important to note.
If I could allow this to continue going for another half hour, I would. But we have to wrap things up. Marina, thank you so much for sharing your research with us and for taking time to join us today. I really feel like you have everyone's minds percolating. I imagine we're going to continue this discussion amongst us even afterwards among the postdocs. And thank you for everyone who joined us today for such a stimulating discussion.